Well, today I have a great guest, someone who has been a articulate explainer of and researcher on mimetic theory. He is the Stieber Chair of Theology at St. Louis University, where he teaches on atheism and Christianity, theological method, 19th century religious thought in Germany. And it's a great honor to have Professor Grant Kaplan with us. How you doing, Grant?
I'm doing well, thank you. Thanks so much for being here.
Yeah, well, it's great to talk to you because I like to get into mimetic theory and apply it to so many different things. And yet I also like to have folks who have been doing a lot of this work. You were able to meet René Girard, so that's pretty cool, right? To have that as something you were able to do.
Yes, it was a great privilege to meet him. After I'd been reading his work for a while, I emailed him to no success, and then I called, and he eventually got back to me. But when he got back to me, he was very generous with his time, and so I was able to spend an afternoon with him. And I later did an interview with him on the phone that was published.
And that was back in what year?
That was in 2007, 2008.
So what was he like interacting with him in person?
He was, to use the California lingo, he was very chill. So he did not come across as very busy at all. He took me to lunch, he paid for it. And then I went back to his residence and met his wife briefly. And we talked there for a bit. And he gave me a copy of the Clausewitz book, which was then only published in French, and wrote a nice inscription in there, which I still obviously have and treasure. So it was really wonderful to meet him. And he, you almost never hear anybody say anything bad about René Girard.
Right. And that's important because I do think that good ideas, it doesn't have to be this way, I guess, but it's nice when great ideas have a kind of autobiographical, connection in terms of a good person of character and wisdom can imbue those qualities into the ideas that they articulate that we should accept, right? Or persuade us to accept, right?
Yes. So there are good reasons for wanting the intellectual and the moral virtues to be sort of paired in people, especially people who we like, imitate, admire, study, all those things.
Right. Now, you have a book, Professor Kaplan, called René Girard, Unlikely Apologist, Mimetic Theory and Fundamental Theology. Briefly, why do you describe René Girard as an unlikely apologist?
Well, because we generally think of apologetics as sort of philosophical arguments, abstract philosophical arguments about the existence of God, or trying to solve the problem of evil, or something like that. So I remember reading C.S. Lewis's A Mere Christianity when I was in high school, because I wasn't sure whether Christianity really made sense. And I remember, at the beginning of college, reading something about theology and science, or Christianity and science, and that it was, again, sort of effort to philosophically explain, or you get sort of biblical apologists who will lay out a logical case for why the Bible can be trusted as a historical document. And that's generally what's considered apologetics. And those kinds of apologetics are generally much less effective now than they were back in the day. So Girard is an unlikely apologist in that he provides a kind of understanding of Christianity, an apology, a defense, if you will, in a manner that is well, there hasn't been much precedent for it. There both has and there hasn't. So he's an apologist in the way that Dante was an apologist.
Mm. And why do you think the classical theistic arguments for apologetics for Christianity don't work as well anymore? Is it because of our postmodern context or something, or something
I mean,
else?
it's partly the postmodern context. It's partly the reason people don't believe is often not the reason given for why they don't believe. So, for example, I had a good friend who was an atheist and he was a philosopher, and he sort of started explaining this in the context of abstract philosophical arguments. And then, later on in the conversation, and this can happen when you have friendships where conversations can build over, days and weeks and months, instead of just friendships that are or conversations that happened in 15 minutes or in a chat. But what came out was that, his real problem with Christianity and God was specifically the church, and specifically the way the funeral of his mother was handled at her parish. And so
Wow.
that, it's one anecdote. And I think the traditional arguments are important. It's important that people know them. It's important that people have their metaphysics straight if they're going to believe in God, especially if they have a kind of intellectual bent to them. But most of the time, our impression of Christianity comes from the people who represent it to us. And so it's kind of on a personal, affective level. And so if you asked me, why do you believe in God, or why do you consider yourself a follower of Jesus? I could say, well, here's the philosophical reasons, and I'm trained to give that kind of answer. But the more honest answer would have to do probably with, people whom I love who are Christian happen to live that life with a lot of integrity, and that's what made it attractive to me.
Wow, that's a very honest answer, I think, for a lot of folks who, have an abiding faith in trusting in Jesus, is what you just said. Um, some people depict Christianity as kind of a low resolution approach to reality in which people need to adore someone or something. And so they just sing songs all day. Oh, aren't you so special, Jesus? Aren't you so great? Wow, I wish I could be like you, Jesus. And they kind of denigrate the concept of needing to come together as a group and sing about someone's name. And you get this idea from the new atheist concept of like, what kind of a narcissist needs people to come around and talk about how great he is all day? What would you say to that?
Well, I mean, the problem with the way we think about praise and praising God, and the Psalms implore this, is that God's not like us. God's not, an insecure person sitting over there saying, oh, I hope I get a positive review on Amazon of my book. It'll make me feel so much better. So we praise God to say something true about ourselves, not to make God feel better. And the truth about ourselves is that we are creatures. We come from somewhere. We didn't self-generate or self-expostulate ourselves. And so prayer in the form of praise is one way to do that. But of course, one is missing the point if one thinks that the point of doing this is so God will feel better about God's self or himself, so God doesn't get mad and give me cancer. I mean, that would be theologically problematic.
When you talk about mimetic desire, have you adjusted your explanation of it over the time that you've been studying this research of, learning about mimetic theory? Like, did you come to it with a certain explanation, and then later on, as you studied it more, you're like, wait, I don't know if that's the best way to
Yeah,
explain it?
I mean, people get it on one level, and then it's like, but that can't be everything. What about this?
Right.
So there's the guy who actually took over Girard's chair at Stanford has this critique of Girard, and it's kind of like, this guy wants us to believe that the only reason you choose Pepsi over Coke or vice versa is because, you're just imitating someone else. And it's kind of reduced to this reductionistic level. And so people, they both get it immediately, but then mimetic desire is a sort of stumbling block, which is kind of ironic given how much Girard makes out of stumbling blocks, and that Girard's theory itself and the terms used to explain it are often sort of a stumbling block to people getting to, appreciate, Girard and all of his genius and all of his insight into what makes us human. So, I mean, the way I would sort of explain it is on the level of attraction, and that when we find something or someone beautiful, our sense is that this is a deep romantic feeling that comes from my depths, and it's an expression of my autonomy to choose what is beautiful. And then for the most part, the standards that we elect for beauty are the standards that have been kind of donated to us by the larger social matrix. And if you just look at the kind of standards of beauty from the 19th to the 20th century to the present age, and so,
so we don't choose even our relationships in a purely individual romantic wellspring of desire in our hearts, but rather what we perceive the characteristics of attractive qualities to be, right, from other people. We borrow other people's ideas.
Yes, and maybe you marry someone who's just like your mom, or you marry someone who's just like your dad, or maybe you marry someone who is the exact opposite of that, or maybe there's someone who has patterned something that makes you, sort of helps direct what you consider to be attractive or beautiful or desirable, and that those factors are working on us in ways that we don't fully understand or comprehend. And so the romantic thing is basically, the Rousseauian romantic, what Girard would call lie or deception, is that you can somehow leave society and become a more authentic person by having your own desires,
Right.
not depending on society. Emerson's famous address at Harvard, the first line of it is, imitation is suicide. Nothing gets at the romantic deceit more than that. And that we want to think this way all the time. We don't want to think that we're dependent for our ideas and all kinds of things on other people, and our attractions and our tastes and this sort of thing. So but these factors are at work in us, almost like a kind of undercurrent. And for Girard, the more honest thing is to admit that you are part of it. You are a social being whose identity is donated by all of these different potential forces of imitation.
So we are or looking around and we don't know what to desire. So we end up picking up unconsciously the behaviors, the patterns, the appetites, the mannerisms, the language from those around us. We're like sponges. We consciously do it and we unconsciously do it, which is a little tricky for people. Like you said, some people, like you were saying, the caricature of, oh, you're telling me that we pick our, food items and everything based on every choice we make, we had to look at somebody. It's not all conscious, but some of it is, right?
Yeah, some of it certainly is. I mean, right now I'm talking to you in a way, and I'm trying to project some kind of intelligence or authority or authenticity or whatever it is. And the fact is that I have models for this. I have professors, and I'm thinking of a couple of them right now, who I probably did pick up some of their patterns of speech, or verbal tics, because they represented to me a form of intelligence that I found desirable. Now, I never said I want to be just like this person, but yeah, how one speaks doesn't just come in a vacuum. I mean, language, nothing's more imitative than language, nothing's more social than language. And so once we step back and sort of look at how we examine a little bit what's going on, then we can see different ways. And if we don't see it immediately, often we'll see it in retrospect.
What is the difference between that and the social construction theory of, critical theory? That everything is socially constructed. Gender is socially constructed. Language is socially constructed. Language constructs reality. All these different things that you see so popular in the critical world, critical theory, critical studies. What is the difference between what Girard is saying on this point and what they're saying? Or there's a lot of similarity, right?
I mean, there is. So I think one part of it is that those social theorists, sometimes that it's a totalizing thing. It's totalizing. It's the entire framework from which one learns, or from which, so kind of horizon in which our freedom is allowed to operate. And I mean, Girard had a more robust understanding of freedom, and he never thought of mimetic theory as purely mechanistic. It doesn't work in a mechanistic way. It works in a more human way for him. So, I mean, if you're a Marxist, then everything is about, different sort of stages of material conditions that you're in that then kind of it's more deterministic. And if you're Freudian, it's going to be deterministic in a different way. And what we have now with a lot of critical race theory is also an understanding that makes it more deterministic in terms of what one thinks about these things. Now, it's not to say that, again, you throw it all out. There is a lot of validity to all three of the theories I mentioned, but I think Girard, when pressed on this point, always deferred to the idea that we are free and we have some ability both to choose who we imitate, and also to then shift those who we imitate. That would make him different.
So, but like, for example, with critical theory, kind of it ends up, at least in the way it's applied, it ends up with the end result being the mimetic desire for power, right? I mean, there's no. I used to ask that to professors, like, okay, so I understand, there's this hegemonic force that's controlling all this stuff, and it's creating all these terrible things and all these things. Okay, but what do we do once we beat that? Once we have completely supplanted that and dethroned that hegemonic power structure, like, what do we do next? And they never really had an answer for that, because their whole framework was all about chasing the car. They don't know what to do once they catch up to it. And Girard was saying the chase is the illusion. We have to basically turn the other cheek. Don't chase the car anymore. Don't chase the power, because that's the mimetic object that's going to create a scandal for everybody, right?
I mean, yeah, Foucault would be someone who, spent a lot of time explaining so many structures in terms of power relations and kind of power relations. And that vocabulary has crept into a lot of things. I mean, a lot of sort of workplace logic is very much rooted in these understandings of power, power dynamics. And I mean, I think, human beings are a little bit more complicated than that. And Girard understood that. And I personally, I like Michel Foucault, what I've read of him. I mean, as a thinker, not necessarily as a person.
You like Foucault? What was that? Did you say that?
Michel Foucault. I like him as a thinker, but yeah, I think Girard would say that it's more complicated than just a reduction to power.
So would you say Foucault is almost as foundational for the modern critical theory as Girard is for his mimetic theory, or would you say there's a little bit more of a pantheon of figures in that development of what we have today?
There is a pantheon. I see people saying that Foucault is the most the dominant intellectual framework that people have in the humanities now and in the academy, and it's odd to me because, as much as people read and are versed in Foucault, it's almost like they forget it entirely when they sort of discourse on certain ethical problems. And if it's all about power, and you do realize the way you're talking about things, it gives certain kinds of people an unchecked amount of power. And Foucault would immediately point to this, and you seem to be sort of willingly avoiding looking at it. I don't mean to be too opaque, but I hope you kind of get my drift.
I wanted to, you're talking about this power. You have an essay in Church Life Journal called René Girard, The Last Nietzschean. And at the end, you talk about one of Nietzsche's more provocative aphorisms from Twilight of the Idols declares, "I fear we have not freed ourselves from God because we still believe in grammar." Here, Nietzsche repeats the madman's concerns about the societal impact of rejecting God. If one substitutes victims for grammar, then the point comes into even greater focus. One can only reject God if one no longer believes in the innocence of victims, or that their suffering should be curtailed, or that their lives matter. A mimetic theology of atheism demonstrates how this position arises from the unveiling of the true nature of the biblical God and the radical reorientation that underlies the most basic affirmation of this God. So, in some sense, you're suggesting that to believe in God is to believe in the innocence of victims. Is that right?
Yes. So specifically the Christian God. So if you say we reject this God and you still believe in the innocence of victims, it shows that you have not rejected that God.
And in this sense, the word innocence is a relative term. It's not an objective, absolute term, right?
Yes. Yes. So another term that is familiar to people in liberation theology is the idea of solidarity with victims. So a lot of people consider their kind of moral authenticity to be determined on whether or not they're in solidarity with victims. And today you can be in solidarity with victims as an atheist or as agnostic or a member of any religious tradition. It's not something exclusive to Christianity, but Girard would say it is the fundamental biblical idea.
Would that mean that an atheist who is in solidarity with victims is actually believing in God and they just don't know it? Or
that would be a kind of Ronner's idea of a kind of anonymous Christianity. That if you think about things this way, you are in a certain way, affirming God. And so one could say that. I mean, I don't like to, in general, tell people that you're really this, even though you don't believe it. You're a humanist, even though you say you hate humans or something.
But that's because we're locked in kind of a Cartesian approach to belief, right? Like I think blank, therefore I am a Christian. I think in Trinitarian theology and all this stuff, so therefore I am a Christian. And you're talking about belief in a way that's much more closer to like trust, right? Like the idea of trust and faith, right?
Well, I mean, Noam Chomsky talked about this idea of deep grammar, and then people have spoken of kind of a deep moral grammar or a moral grammar. And so what Girard says repeatedly is that this notion that we are naturally in solidarity with victims, if you know the history of humanity, it's simply nonsense. It is absurd that to think that human beings have historically been in solidarity with victims. If you were a victim, generally, it's because you deserved it. just like when we were all in sixth grade and there was one kid being made fun of, what most of us thought in sixth grade or fourth grade, or maybe longer than that, is that if everybody's making fun of this kid or picking on him or bullying him, it's because he deserves it. And that's generally the sort of moral grammar of most of humanity. And that for Girard, Judeo-Christianity, biblical religion, reversed that. It overturned it. And Nietzsche also saw that. That's what he talked about when he talked about a genealogy of morals, that we went from a master morality to a slave morality. And so when Nietzsche says, we can't get rid of God and still believe in grammar, I mean, he's basically saying if we really get rid of God, if we unhitch ourselves from that, then so many ideas that follow from it also need to be abandoned. And we really need to kind of embrace a radical form of nihilism. And we need to sort of toughen up and be these real, looking into the abyss kind of atheists. And here's where you get a lot of that, people sort of making fun of the Nietzschean sort of pose. And you can take that same thing and apply it to Girard in the sense that, okay, if you really want to get rid of the God of the Bible, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, okay, but that means you can't have solidarity with victims anymore. It no longer makes sense because it came out of this moral grammar, comes out of a tradition. And if you're rejecting that tradition, you can't, now you can, it doesn't mean that you can sort of demand, no, you're not allowed to be in solidarity with victims if you're an atheist. I mean, but eventually, and we don't know how long it will take, but it will fade from the culture, and we're already seeing this in some places. But you're unhooking the cart from the horse, and eventually the cart just kind of goes off in another direction.
So this victimism that we see all around us recognizes the innocence of victims. You look at, they've created, a shrine almost around where the death of George Floyd took place, right? So there is a deep, deep, deep desire to stand in solidarity with victims. It is the biggest animating force in our culture in the West, which is, where's the energy? The energy is always going to be found in those people who are perceived to be the most victimized in the culture at that moment. In terms of events, stories, scandals, abuse from police, abuse from corruption, all of the energy in the culture is, and people are always striving to grab a hold of that energy and use that perception of solidarity with victims as an attempt to accumulate power. So obviously it doesn't quite work out the way Jesus talks about, where he says being in solidarity with victims, but not creating this perception that, you're not, capable of scapegoating yourself, or so on and so forth. So how do we enter that conversation in a way that provides that proper Christian angle to solidarity with victims?
Yeah, I mean, it's vexing. But in general, solidarity with victims is good. We should care. I'm speaking from a Christian perspective. We should care about the poor and the marginalized, the voiceless, and to be in solidarity with them is to take their concerns, their plight seriously, and when possible, do the things to make a more just society. I think that's we want to do those kind of things, but the problem is when, as you mentioned, then it becomes a sort of power dynamic, right? And so one's victim status then becomes a position from which one can accrue power, but also victimize others in a way that is not necessarily anticipated by people, or it's not obvious, it's not noticed as quickly. So the thing about Christianity is that, I mean, you think about the conversion of Paul and Peter, and it's like they felt this deep remorse. I was part of the crowd. I was there stoning Stephen. I was there denying Christ and 3 times before the cock crowed. And so there's a sense of kind of remorse and repentance, and what Christianity is supposed to bring us into is a space in which we acquire virtues, participate in rituals, become habituated into sort of patterns of forgiveness, which is all sort of dependent on us reckoning with our continued sinfulness. I am a Christian, and that doesn't mean I'm all of a sudden a good person who understands things. It means I'm continually sinning, and one hopes that one gets better, but part of it is kind of attending to this. And so what we've replaced almost all, we've sort of tried to do a shortcut, I think, where we get around any sort of self recognition of being part of the problem, to then just simply kind of my ethical stance of being in solidarity with victims makes me better than you, or I'm in solidarity with the right victims, you're in solidarity with the wrong victims. And I mean, we see the absurdity of this in the kind of, the conversation from last summer, Black Lives Matter, Blue Lives Matter. Well, from a certain perspective, there's a greater claim to victimhood in one group than another, right? And so it's like, I'm on the side of the right victims, you're on the side of the wrong victims, or you're posing as it. And when we get into that space, that it's hard to kind of see how we're ever going to get out of it. And I think that's one of the reasons why people feel so exhausted right now. Because it's constantly, one is forced to pick a side, and that we don't feel great about it sometimes, of, whether it's the cancellations or all these other things. We don't feel great about either ignoring it or participating in it, because we got a sense that the tug is always going to be there.
And it's part of the process of coming to terms with the recognition of the scapegoating mechanism as it continues to persist in our time. I point out, if a person is losing their life for a petty thing, that is a injustice. But at the same time, the way our society has developed all these different layers of scapegoats as kind of like fail-safes to prevent the crowd from actually recognizing their own complicity in the violence. So, for example, the police are they function as both persons with agency in terms of making the wrong move in a high stakes, scary moment, but also they function as scapegoats when things go wrong. When, I tell people all the time, they made T-shirts saying, "I can't breathe" about Eric Garner, but they did nothing to get rid of the law that allowed for people armed with the option of deadly force to arrest a man for selling unlicensed cigarettes. I mean, that's the occasion for the scandal to occur. And society doesn't want to say, hey, wait a second, we're the voters that elected these people that keep these laws on the books. So there's different fail-safes that they have to prevent the human person from recognizing their complicity with these bad things. So they say, well, it's the police. The police have this problem. They're biased. Well, no. I mean, if you have a situation where you're asked to enforce a law about licensed cigarettes and you have the legal, qualified immunity to use deadly force if necessary, that was put there by the crowd. But the crowd doesn't want to recognize their complicity in creating these scandals. So they say it's the police. And if that doesn't work, they say it's the politicians. It's, this or that, or it's, the social construction of whiteness, But the problem is that the record of history shows that when you give human beings this kind of power, it will inevitably result in abuse and oppression. But nobody wants to talk about that, you know?
Yeah, no, I mean, and I grew up a liberal in some ways. I still have those kind of, moral leanings. But I remember just being outraged by an oil spill. It was one of those egregious oil spill things. And it was this time it just seemed like they're really guilty. And I was talking with a friend of mine, a scientist who's coincidentally a Girardian. And he's like, but you're so outraged at this company, British Petroleum or whoever it was. But why are they drilling there in the first place? It's because we want the oil. We want this cheap way of living. We want to pay, $2.50 a gallon for gas. And that, yeah, but we're outraged at them, and it's a way to kind of exculpate ourselves. Well, it's all their fault, so therefore it's none of my fault. And you get that with environmentalism, with policing justice, all these sorts of things that we ultimately have, as a society, as a democracy, at the very least the power to choose who's going to represent us. And that you're right, there are laws that are in place, and a lot of people then they just want to kind of blame the cop and stop it there. And so, as much as I, have a kind of moral revulsion at the police brutality that we've all sort of seen on camera, it's not enough simply to say that cops are the problem, either individual bad apple cops or policing culture. Like there's a wider thing that you got at there, probably more articulately than I'm getting at.
Well, it's like you said earlier about how we assume that, that we could be in solidarity with victims, but even whenever there's like you said, people deserve what they got, right? And even when there's like a grand jury investigation that we hear about in the news, we automatically, even people who are like naturally going to be like ideologically against something, I mean, give an example. So I am against victimless crime laws, right? Nonviolent crimes, no victim, no crime. That's my big, I think that's a big thing to explain if you're a Christian, but I understand there's differences on that. But like, even if I see a news story that says so-and-so is being investigated for some kind of crime, I'm like, wait, where's the victim on it? But still there's this subconscious gross factor that we have, that if the special prosecutor has been called, there's something gross or icky about the person, right? Even though like intellectually I'm like, no, that there's no victim there, that there's no reason for me to be feeling this way. But we're so trained to feel like the otherization is taking place, and we still feel this kind of factor, like, oh, I don't want to be around that. And I think that's from the scapegoat mechanism. Those are vestiges of that still persist, in our time.
Richard Beck has that book called Unclean, and he just talks about how there's these, different kind of experiments you run, and you have a cockroach in a glass of orange juice, and you take it out and you give it to someone and say, oh, do you want to drink it? No. Right. Okay. I wouldn't want to drink it. And then, it's like, okay, so we put it through this purifier and all of the contamination is out. So the orange juice is 100% clean. Do you want to drink it now? And a lot of people still say no. And it's this notion of like contamination. And I mean, one of the metaphors in the Psalms for sin is like stain, it's a stain. And we have obviously the, Lady Macbeth notion of sin as stain. That's probably more culturally closer to us. But yeah, it's something stained, it's tainted, and it can't be sort of untainted again. And so, I mean, I guess one way to sort of understand ourselves is what are the crimes, what are the kinds of people who are forever tainted, and I taught in prison a few years ago some high felony type people, and and I mean, people who are in there for murder, and one guy is potentially getting out, and it's for society, for a large part of society, it's still the case that you did this thing 30 years ago. You're like forever tainted. but I think that's like the odd thing is a capital offense that's shifting, and that we're more likely to be lenient to someone who 30 years after, if he's repentant, we could say, okay, maybe you can rejoin a part of society. And I think the sexual crimes now are the ones that are just like, you're forever tainted by this. And
and then
maybe that's better. I don't know, but it's just simply an observation that for some people, like this, the stink can never go away.
And then we have all these other ways of like denying the gravity of what takes place in the taking of life. Ashley Babbitt was the Trump supporter who was storming the Capitol. She gets shot and killed. If that, I believe if that was another case, if that was a left-wing person storming the Capitol when Trump first got elected, I think the media narrative would be a little different on there based on their biases. But it's considered like, well, that's not really a story that's going to be told as compassion for people losing their life. Same thing with like soldiers and wars. So many folks end up losing their life overseas because of, for example, the insurrections that our government, stokes around the world. But somehow, some way, if the insurrections in Damascus, if it's in Libya, if it's in Yemen, if it's something that we started with the Arab Spring, somehow the distance between us and the carnage that our government that we elect to represent us does, those lives don't seem to matter as much as compared to something closer to home, like the storming of the Capitol in DC. That what I mean? It's like, so we have all these different ways of putting distance between us and the recognition of the sanctity of life in certain cases. Does that make sense?
I mean, the modern, logic around the state is generally the state's violence is necessary. And that's the long time, the way that we've looked at it. And what seems to me to be changing with policing, and policing, the reputation of policing was so high, according to polling, for such a long time, and that police were kind of neighborhood heroes, and that narrative has definitely changed. I'd say in some instances, it's kind of swinging too far in a direction of kind of almost despising this profession. But yeah, I mean, there's been a real sense that no, the police are just arbitrarily out there killing people. They're basically like vigilantes. And that seems to be the kind of, and it's not that this is without basis. I mean, and that the use of deadly force has been, it seems to have been going up. I'm not certain of that, but it seems anecdotally to be going up. So I think there has almost been this kind of check, like, okay, well, now something needs to, it is no longer a necessary violence. What I like about your intuition is that, okay, well, why don't we extend that to the military things overseas and see a lot more state-sponsored violence as unnecessary.
Right. And again, it's because I think that the soldier, the police officer are vestiges of sacrificial units that that society uses to kind of offload, negative energy. Like, you offload it. I'm not using a proper, scholarly term here, but you're basically offloading this pent up aggression that would consume us internally. Now, the interesting thing is that all of this internal strife that's starting to eat up America is happening at the same time that our government's wars are becoming less and less popular. So it's as if the scapegoats of far away are not providing the cathartic high that they used to. You can trace this back for a long time, but you can go back to Vietnam, but there's this constant, every time there's a new scapegoat, it has less and less psychological energy for the native population at home to feel satisfied by, hey, let's go get Saddam Hussein. They're like, yes, let's go do it. That 9/11 just happened like 2 years ago or a year ago. Then it goes into, hey, let's go get Gaddafi. And we're like, really? What's that about? I thought you guys like selling weapons and stuff. And then it's, hey, let's go get Assad. And like, really? Are we still doing this? And at the same time that's happening, all of a sudden the violence that used to be off-let outside of the American empire is now coming back home to roost. I mean, Barack Obama's his old pastor used to say that, the chickens are coming home to roost.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, Barack Obama kind of helped accelerate that by starting some more failed interventions that kind of backfired. It's kind of like the idea in the Old Testament of the strange fire, right? That you have the wrong sacrificial ritual and it backfires and it creates scandals within the community if you don't provide the ritual in a sufficient way that everybody believes in it and says, yes, let's go send a full occupation force. Let's get rid of Assad. I mean, we just saw John Kerry and his wife having dinner with Assad a few years ago, but yeah, it sounds like let's go destroy him. He's a monster. And it's like, it doesn't work as well. So now we're starting to fracture and schism and fall apart internally.
Yeah, I mean, after 9/11, there was a sort of unified sense. And even the Gulf War, I mean, the approval rating was something like 80%. And that was the same thing. I mean, you could find pictures of Bush and Rumsfeld, sitting right next to Hussein from the 80s. And then it was like, well, he's the bad guy now. And so, I mean, you put your finger on something, which is that there's the sort of external politics. We're post Cold War. We're in a way, we're post 9/11. No one really paid much attention when we kind of were withdrawing from Afghanistan, or it's something that doesn't grab news headlines anymore. So I think we're post 9/11 in a way. And then the question is then, I mean, what is bringing us together that prevents a kind of internal escalation of tensions? And it seems like, the old notion of, well, we're all Americans and we should have that basic kind of common respect, like that's basically gone. And that now it's like right and left are in permanent war with one another. It's just sort of a permanent state of, you are not only on the other side politically, but what you stand for is undermining the very existence of America, the hope of America. And so you are like an existential threat.
Yeah.
And that's felt strongly by both sides. And so according to the logic here, then if there could be a third to distract us from this, that would kind of help. There's not. The world's getting smaller. And we just need to find a better way of not demonizing the other.
And the Pentagon's trotting out UFOs now, but I think we're yawning. We don't even want that scapegoat. We're like, come on, give us something else. Come on, come up with something else. You got Bigfoot, what you got for us? Nothing satisfies our need for a common enemy anymore. They're like, hey, look, we've got videos of UFOs. And we're like, come on, what else is on TV?
In a way, COVID was a common enemy, but then, of course, the combating of COVID became so politically divisive that it just became another occasion. Instead of coming together behind something, it became another occasion by which to mark which side one was on.
And that's an effect of what Jesus did when he destroyed the scapegoat mechanism, going back to the Girardian stuff, right?
Yes.
In the old days, instead of CDC tells us or the science says, it would be the power of Odin declares we are to do these rituals or the plague is going to devour us. And now we don't have that big other that unites us anymore. And anytime someone asserts a big other, like Dr. Fauci says, it automatically creates schism, just like the resurrection created schism in its own community where you were saying, hey, look, we're going to have division now. And that's what Jesus said. I've come to bring a sword to cut through these formal structures of peace that were based on solidarity of one another by excluding a common scapegoat. That's dissolved. So is the gospel bad news if we can't figure out how to obey and do what the nonviolent response that Jesus is compelling his followers to partake in, right?
Yeah, I mean, that's what Girard says in Battling to the End, that basically, Christianity creates this dangerous situation in which the old tricks don't work anymore. They lose their power. And so what does one have to turn to? And so the old risk was just sort of scapegoating without end, a kind of Aztec thing where your logic for being is so consumed by the need to find victims that it almost doesn't allow you to do anything else. And the new situation seems to be, or the alternative problematic result would be then what you have is a kind of, scapegoating doesn't work, but then there's no kind of, love and forgiveness and ability for people to reconcile with one another. And so that, Girard talks a lot about self-sacrifice. What's different about Christianity isn't just that it's anti-sacrificial, but that it's self-sacrificial. And and so, there's no greater love than this, to lay down your life for your friends. And so, so sometimes in personal situations and in political and social situations, that ability to basically self-sacrifice is again, not in an aggrandizing way, like I'll be the scapegoat for everyone, is a kind of attention grabbing thing, but an authentic form of self-sacrifice is probably what we need more than anything else. And it has a way of kind of diffusing this escalation. So it's just, no, it's you, and it's a back and forth forever. And if you just simply say, okay, it's me, then it stops that, right? And the problem is that if you believe in truth, then it creates a situation in which, well, then if people just get rewarded for lying, right?
Right, and that's what cancel culture is doing, where once you get the admission of guilt, then the scapegoating escalates, right? And that's the problem with that. How do you do forgiveness and acceptance of one's responsibility at the same time? Never apologize to a scapegoating mob, because then you're going to be devoured for lunch, and that's what we see. We see that with the persecution texts of witches. They have to get the confession, I am a witch, now we really got to kill you, and it's like,
and that's one thing that, I am not a Donald Trump fan in the least, but one thing that he understood is that, look, there's no point of ever apologizing. Don't ever apologize. And that's a horrible way to live. Like, I have 3 kids, and if I can't get them to apologize, my gosh, who am I sending out into the world? But then when you have people totally unwilling to accept any form of apology, it's like, what kind of lesson is that giving? And so, I'm a baseball fan. And so when there was a scandal with my favorite team, the Houston Astros, and then it was like, okay, it's bad. They were cheating. They were stealing signs, banging on a trash can. And then, they had a whole thing of they were going to have this press conference and say they were sorry. And, I was like, oh, okay, they said they were sorry. Some of these guys, they stopped going to school when they were 15, and, some of them know about 30 words of English. And so I don't know what you're expecting. Like, they're not super articulate. They're professional baseball players. But people were then just outraged, like, oh, the apology wasn't authentic. And why didn't they say this? And no matter what it wasn't good enough. And then it's like, well, what do you expect? Like, if someone says, there are people have written a lot about kind of what are the sort of rules for apologizing. But if you're putting yourself in a vulnerable place by saying it's my fault, you need, the other side needs to give a little bit. And that's something that, Jesus was so attuned to these dynamics in the Gospels. And a lot of people now, it's just, no, you're forever on the outside, you're forever excluded. And I don't have to ever forgive you. And that gets really, into a dangerous space.
I do think that Jesus didn't admit that he was wrong when he was persecuted. He just did not respond with reciprocal aggression. And I think we could model that too. Not that if you do something wrong, you should admit it. If you steal something, you should admit it. But this idea of saying, well, I need to accept that, it is my, privilege, which is the heart of all sins in the world. And then if I don't accept that scapegoating, then that is an anti-Christian approach to dealing with resolutions and reconciliation. A proper approach would be to say, acknowledging people's pains, but not accepting the guilt. You see what I mean? If you receive, oh, I am the vessel of guilt, what you're in effect doing is creating a kind of Christian mutated scapegoating deification of yourself. I think you see that when you see these people doing these rituals in the streets where they're all laying down saying, I can't breathe, like they're doing a liturgy. They're doing a street liturgy of these, most of these young kids are very privileged themselves, but they feel like I can self-flagellate. I can't breathe, but I will go ahead and get up and then vote for Joe Biden, who spent 50 years, doing perpetual regime change around the world, mostly on people of color, and say, I'm okay because I did the ritual. I self-flagellated and said, I can't breathe. That's cool. That's trendy. That's an Instagram thing. And then I get to do my dirty deed in secret and vote for the perpetuation of, mass incarceration and all the laws that are still on the books. So there's this weird thing that we need to come to grips with. And it's on both sides, but I'm just trying to get people to understand, like, how do we use the insights of mimetic theory to stop this constant, self-flagellation as some kind of superficial atonement ritual or indulgence ritual that somehow pays off our sins that we can perpetually keep doing. This isn't going to last. It's going to create chaos if it keeps going.
Yeah, I mean, I do think there is some kind of para-religious activity happening where, it's like our politics or our religion now or something like this. And I mean, this kind of identification with these causes that seems so sort of total and extreme. And I guess, you could have a sort of para-religious thing with a lot of the, QAnon conspiracies and these sorts of things on the right. And, that there's, you mentioned examples on the left, but yeah, it does seem to be, what Chesterton said is the problem is not, people don't believe in God. They don't believe in anything. If they don't stop believing in God, they believe in even crazier things. And I think that prophecy is very much true today.
Now, I have two questions as we wrap up here. One is, some people have suggested that violence that we see, the tribal violence that we see in history that Girard points out with mimetic theory, is actually a simpler explanation for it is just, evolutionary, fighting over resources and, survival. Do you believe that to be the case? I mean, some people have said mimetic theory is a more complex explanation for something that can be more easily satisfied with like an evolutionary theory of, people are fighting over scarce resources. They're fighting over access to, land and, things like that. And that's what's really driving so much of the violence through history. What would you say to that?
I mean, it is sometimes if there's only one, if there's one chicken and everybody's hungry and you're fighting over it, that seems to be violence almost on a kind of natural, instinctual level. The problem is we have such a record of other kinds of ritualized violence. I mean, an overwhelming record in favor of it that I think Girard's explanation just covers more territory than the other one.
Okay, and the second question I have is, Jesus said he came to save the world, right? In this idea of, for God so loved the world that he sent his only begotten son, that whosoever believeth in him shall not perish, but have eternal life. And this idea of saving the world is this concept that's tied to this expectation of the Messiah. And so my thought here is Jesus going to accomplish his mission in history, or is it all going to just kind of fall apart? And then it's like when you get on a theme park ride, when we die or whatever, at some point in some kind of eschatological conclusion, you get on the ride. And once you're on the ride kind of takes over and takes you on the experience and you come back. You know what I mean? That's the way I think that's how Christianity is conceived by most Christians, is that, Jesus did this great thing. and then it's kind of like Vietnam. It all kind of turns to hell, and then there's a few soldiers on the tops of roofs that are getting picked up and evacuated from the disaster hellhole that basically Jesus unleashed on accident because he tried to give us some really awesome pathway, but at the same time, it destroyed the scapegoat mechanism. And we don't know how to emulate his nonviolent way. So we're just left in this hell of never ending mimetic aggression. And so it's a total disaster. And all we're doing in the middle is just trying to pick up a few bodies to save them from the battlefield of this disaster. And then at some point, Jesus is going to come on. And when he comes, it's like, again, I remember like going to Disney World, you get on the ride and you don't have to do anything at that point. It's kind of like set in motion. And that's the eschatological event that brings in the kingdom of God. That's how I think most Christians in various camps actually think of the end of time, that there's nothing we can do to make it better. Jesus is only going to save the world after all of this stuff totally looks like a mess. He's going to come out at the last minute, and that's when it's going to go on autopilot. We're all going to float or whatever it is. And I don't want to get into the details. I'm just saying, is Jesus going to save the world in history through his body, which he says we are the body, we are his body acting with agency on earth? Is he going to succeed?
I'd be a little bit more positive about the effects of, Christianity and Judeo-Christian civilization on the world. I think overall it's been a very, very much a net positive in terms of, hospitals and universities and science and all those kind of things. And solidarity, ethical solidarity, human rights, dignity of the individual, all those things I think have been overwhelming net positives. But I think, God created the world good, and that, the second coming is a lot like the first, I would say, and that, God freely created the world out of love, and that ultimately what we're meant for is union with God, and that and that death is not the ultimate barrier from us having union with God. That may be too vague, but that's ultimately what I think the message is saying, and it's one that I believe in.
So it's not all downhill. I hear so many fans of Rene Girard that conclude that, based on kind of what he says in his last book, that it's all kind of like Christianity predicts its own failure, and therefore we're just kind of enduring the end as this kind of terrible flailing about in hell. I just don't I don't know if that's exact. I'm not saying it's deterministic one way or another. I just don't know if that's actually what's happening. I take a long-term optimistic view that the fact that the scapegoat mechanism has to hide itself in ever more clever and pernicious ways to maintain its effect on people is a sign that it's a mechanism in defeat and in retreat. And so if the church would only do its job in presenting an anthropology of Jesus in an accurate way, it could provide such a help for people to navigate these times. And yet it's almost crickets in terms of the institutions of church to even talk about these ideas as we've talked about them today. I mean, what I'm talking, you and I are familiar with this Girardian approach to Christianity, but it's so alien to the average person who's just gone to church. And I'm not saying that to denigrate Christianity. I think that they have a theology, but they don't have an anthropology. And without an anthropology, you don't really know how to understand why history is looking the way it's looking,
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I mean, I am, I'm by nature an optimist, although most of my friends don't know that about me. They don't recognize it. So, but I think Girard's anthropology opens up a lot of windows, but in terms of the progress, I mean, it's one saint at a time, one conversion at a time. And ultimately, it doesn't matter what kind of policies we have in place. I'd like to have better policies. I'd like to have more just laws, all that kind of stuff. But it's one person accepting grace and then living that out in a way that is graceful and recognizes the gift that's given, and sort of hands it on to others. It's just, I just don't know if there's not another way. And so what the church ultimately has always relied on is the witness of saints, and it will continue to do that. And if we don't cultivate them, I mean, what we know now is our leadership isn't very holy. I'm Catholic. I mean, we know the leadership isn't going to save the church, but it was always stupid to think that. And so, I hope we stop canonizing popes. I'm sure there's been some great ones. Let's just stop with the canonization of popes and stop associating authority with holiness. And that ultimately, you and I can live the gospel in a way that's truthful and authentic and real, and that there's no barrier, based on my lack of holding a church office from me doing that.
Very well said. Professor Grant Kaplan, it's been a pleasure speaking with you. And you have a new book coming out called Faith and Reason Through Christian History, a theological essay. When's that come out, and what's it about for folks who are interested?
It should be out in the winter of 2022 with Catholic University of America Press. So it's how Christians understand the relationship between faith and reason historically, from more or less St. Paul through Pope Francis. So talk about, leading figures all through Christian history and the kind of challenges they faced, and sort of end with the present moment. So questions like, science and religion and postmodernism and that kind of stuff.
Thank you for your time. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you, David. Take care.